2008, I lost my brother Mark to suicide, so he took his own life that year. I always said to my kids, there's always a silver lining, and when Mark died, there just wasn't. And so I just felt like I had to go about and create one. Mark didn't have a mental illness, he just had a number of life curveballs thrown at him and then got the wrong help. It was after a couple of years, and I still remember a couple of years later looking up and actually realising that the sky was blue for the first time. It was then that I thought, okay, I've got to do something. I've got to create this silver lining. Never have imagined that it would become, you know, what we are today, what Rose in the Ocean does now, but I did know that it needed to bring suicide to the forefront of conversation, and we needed to be talking to the people who knew what it was like.
Roses in the Ocean and Bronwyn Edwards they added a lot of value to our engagement on the ground this year in Roma. People with lived experience are people that have got a lot to offer. So once you start engaging them, then they reveal whole new insights to the way you do business.
It's number one, because you can win their confidence with your story by just explaining to them what you did, what you went through, how it affected you.
Well, let's go back to the people that have had this trauma in their lives around suicide, and let's ask them, how can we develop a better model?
For us to be able to come and contribute in any way that adds value and bring that lived experience voice, but more than that is raise the awareness of how local people with a lived experience can really be contributing to suicide prevention.
It's 14 months on since the last roundtables, and probably the biggest difference is the country. You know, there's a tangible difference in the mood of the place. Even to walk out and get your nostrils full of fresh cut grass, you definitely get relief. It's like a cold beer, you know, when it rains, you definitely get relief. But you've got to still work through the impacts of what's happened.
Droughts are these insidious things that you don't know when they've started, and you certainly don't know when it's finished.
So you kind of have this green drought effect, that when you do get feed, you're now faced with making more decisions, and that in itself can bring on another level of concern, I suppose, around what decisions to make.
And now it's rained and the paddocks are full of grass, and those questions are back, you know, and there's no certainty about what they do in drought issues. So I think if we can resolve some of that for producers and communities, it would help.
The image of people living in the bush is, you know, one of strong strength, can cope with anything, and generally that's the case. But we've got to make sure we don't leave people behind.
We're getting a lot more people coming through the door. I think there's a lot less stigma in relation to kind of putting your hand up.
We did unpack stigma a bit again, and most people acknowledge it still can be a significant barrier, and a big part of that stigma was from language.
We don't say committed suicide anymore, or we don't want to. Most people in community still do. You know, it stems from the fact that it used to be against the law in Australia to take your own life.
We actually talk about social and emotional wellbeing. We don't talk about mental health, and we don't mention words like triage and all that, and it's about the terminology we use. You know, come down and have a yarn, have a cuppa.
Do people really want to be going to facilities and being treated? So that sort of language makes a big difference as to how people feel able to step through a door and actually access some help.
What I've heard that's really quite, I suppose, energising and empowering is just the breadth of community representation and interest in mental health, drug and alcohol and suicide prevention. And why that's so important is around people taking ownership and responsibility for what happens in this area.
The mental health plan is we don't physically deliver services ourselves, we commission them. So they're a plan to help us commission services. And it's to look at the forward years of 5 years, and what we want to change and achieve over 5 years. We're not starting from scratch though, so that's the good news. So this is a refresh. So we've learned a hell of a lot since we did the first plan.
It was great to be invited to come out here to Roma, because the big big thing about what Rose in the Ocean do, you know, one of our core focuses is building that capacity of lived experience people to have their voices heard.
I think right across the bush, the conversations are flowing now where they weren't, you know, four years ago when we launched the plan. So we're in a really good position now to really capture a lot of that and start to put that into a form that can help guide people on this process.
I still experience really intense grief. I miss him. I miss him like hell, and I'd have him back in a heartbeat and not have anything to do with Roses in the Ocean existing. But that's being selfish, you know, because I know that we help a lot of people, and that's incredibly rewarding.
If anything in this story causes you concern and you think you might want to have a yarn with someone, or you know someone who could use some support, you can talk right now. Starting the conversation is a first step to getting back on the road to living well.